When my mother showed up at my house asking to see her grandchild, I looked her straight in the eye and coldly shouted, "Get out of here! You're no longer my mother." That was the last thing I ever said to the woman who gave birth to me, and after those words left my mouth, my life turned completely different. But to understand how a child could say something so cruel to their mother, let me tell you my story. I'll walk you through what I went through. Hello, everyone. My name is Iowa. I'm 34 years old. I work as a maintenance engineer at a small Indiana factory in the American Midwest. Right now, I live with my husband and our 3-year-old son. That little boy is the most precious thing I have in this world. Looking at where we are now, most people wouldn't know that behind our son's smile were some tough days we had to survive. Robert and I got married when I was 26. After 2 back-to-back miscarriages, we had nearly lost all hope of having a child. Then came the 3rd pregnancy. The doctor told us that if we wanted to keep the baby, I'd have to get a McKenna shot every week, each one costing $1,000, and no insurance would cover that drug. To save the life of the baby we had already lost twice before, I knew I didn't have a choice. I decided to sell the piece of land Robert and I had saved up for years to buy. That land was supposed to be where we built our first house, our own home. When I made that decision, there was only one thought: we must keep this baby no matter what it takes. But then came a blow straight from my own family, one that took away the only place I had ever thought of as safe. My story happened 3 years ago. Robert and I were 26 weeks into the pregnancy at the time, and we were just a few days away from starting the medication. After selling the land and pulling together every bit of our savings, I transferred $29,000 into an account I thought was safe. It was an old account I had used years ago when I used to help my mom handle the household finances. Back then, all I cared about was speed and convenience. I didn't even remember that her name was still on the account. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, just as I was getting ready to go to the hospital for my first injection, a bank notification popped up on my phone. I opened it out of habit, thinking it was just a routine update, but the number on the screen froze me in place. The balance was $12.64. I thought I was seeing it wrong. I closed the app and opened it again, but it was still the same. $12.64. I logged in a few more times to ensure I wasn't imagining it, but the number didn't change. And every time I looked at it, I felt something inside me go cold. I saw the withdrawal at the top once I was calm enough to check the transaction history. A single withdrawal, but it was everything. Right next to it, in bold red letters, it showed $29,000 had just been transferred. Just one quiet transaction washed away everything Robert and I had worked for all those years. In that moment, I couldn't even feel anything, just a deep, hollow emptiness. The money Robert and I had set aside to protect the life of a child, not even born yet, was gone. And the person who did it was my mother. After I saw my mother's name on the transfer record, the rage inside me turned into something almost instinctual. I ran straight downstairs and rushed toward her room, demanding an explanation. But the room was empty. Everything was still in place. Nothing looked out of order except for one thing. Her coat was gone from the hook on the door. A tight feeling crept down my spine. I knew she had left early that morning, and the first place that came to my mind was the bank. I grabbed my phone, took a deep breath to steady myself, and called her. She picked up after just one ring, almost like she'd been waiting for the call. As soon as I heard that familiar voice on the other end, I gripped the phone tighter and asked through clenched teeth, "Where did you take that money?" Without a pause, in a calm voice that felt colder than ice, she answered, "I bought Brian a car. He needs a new one for work." I froze, felt like every sound in the house had vanished for a second. A part of me was still hoping she was joking, but her voice, so calm, so unaffected, shattered that hope instantly. A few seconds passed before I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked, "What about my child? He deserves a chance to live too." And then, with that same flat, indifferent tone, she said, "That child might not even make it. Brian's getting his life together. He has a clearer future." As soon as she said that, my throat went dry. A wave of emptiness started rising from my chest and spread through my whole body. It wasn't rage, it was numbness. When I didn't respond, she kept going. "That account is in my name. I have every right to use it." Hearing that, I felt like my feet were bolted to the ground. My body stopped reacting. I couldn't even tell if I was still standing or hadn't collapsed yet. And then, as if she hadn't said enough, in a slow, cutting voice, she ended the call with a sentence I will never forget. Robert needs to learn how to let go. Stop holding on to something that was never really his. You two wasted your youth chasing after children that weren't worth it. As those words left her mouth, Robert stepped out from the hallway behind me. I had no idea how long he'd been standing there, but I knew he'd heard every word. I turned to look at him. His hands were trembling. His face was tense, but his eyes were strangely calm. I had never seen Robert like that. My husband had once been one of the strongest men I knew. He used to be the head accountant at a major company in Indianapolis, the kind of person who always had an answer, always knew what to do. But after losing 2 pregnancies in a row, he'd nearly fallen apart. His own family had cut us off, believing that keeping this pregnancy was a mistake, and he accepted all of it to hold on to the little family we were trying to build. And now he stood there in silence, didn't say a word. All I saw in his eyes was the exhaustion of someone who had lost too much but never allowed himself to break. Looking at Robert with the baby still growing inside me, I had no idea what would happen next. All I knew was that I had to get that money back. But deep down, something told me what I'd just lost might not be the end of it. After calming Robert down, I told him to stay home and rest. As for me, I drove straight to the bank, clinging to one last bit of hope that maybe, just maybe, the transaction hadn't been fully processed yet and could still be stopped. But when I gave the teller the account number and asked her to check, she looked at me with a hesitant, almost sympathetic expression. After a few moments of verification, she gently told me the transaction had already been completed and the transfer had been confirmed legitimate. The bank couldn't reverse the funds. I went numb hearing that. It felt like all the blood rushed to my head while the rest of my body turned cold. At that point, I wasn't even angry. I wasn't panicking. All I felt was the strange, expanding emptiness inside my chest, like I had just lost something vital, something I never truly had the right to keep in the first place. I pulled out my phone and checked all our remaining accounts on the way home. There were only a few hundred left, not even enough to cover the first injection, let alone the weeks of treatment ahead. Everything Robert and I had worked for, scraped together dollar by dollar, was now reduced to a quiet number that couldn't do a thing. The GoFundMe page I had started a few weeks back was still there. A few shares from old friends, a couple hundred from kind strangers, but the goal was still painfully far away. I updated the page with the latest ultrasound photo and attached the medical report. Then I set the phone down on the passenger seat, not knowing what to do next. 30 minutes passed. I was still sitting in the car in the bank's parking lot. Sunlight poured through the windshield, but everything inside me felt dark. I used to believe I was strong enough to lead, protect my husband and child, and steer our family through hard times. But right then, I was just a grown woman watching everything fall apart, powerless in the chaos of life. I honestly had no idea how I was going to find the money to save the child who hadn't even been born yet. I even thought about selling the car I was sitting in. But then I asked myself, how would I get to the hospital if I sold the car? And after that, then what? Everything in my head was tangled like a burnt-up mess of wires, and only one question kept looping over and over. How do I save my child? When I got home, Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped together. He wasn't crying, but his eyes were hollow, like someone who had just woken up from a shattered dream and no longer knew what to believe in. Looking at him, I remembered something clearly from the night before, when he turned his back to me and whispered in a hoarse voice, "If we lose this one too, I won't be able to get back up." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay on my feet either. All I knew was that with everything we had left, however little that was, I had promised myself I would hold on to what little we still had, what was being torn apart right in front of us by the coldness and cruelty of the woman who gave me life. That whole day, I ran around making calls, reaching out anywhere I could, hoping that anyone would say there was still a way to recover the money, that I could cling to something like a final lifeline. But no lifeline ever came. And so, I was left with one faint hope, that my mother would come back and explain something, anything, that could help me understand. I didn't expect an apology. I just hoped she could see what we were fighting to protect. I heard the door open when I began letting go of that hope. My mother walked in, and behind her was Brian. But within minutes, the words that came out of her mouth made it painfully clear that what I had lost wasn't just money. It was every last piece of what I had once believed family meant. After being gone all day, they came home from wherever they'd been. Calm and unbothered, Brian tossed a set of car keys onto the table. I saw the purchase paperwork from the dealership, invoice still tucked in the corner. I couldn't wait another second. The anger inside me was boiling over. I walked straight toward my mother, looked her in the eye, and with a voice so tight it cracked open, I shouted, "Give me the money back, right now." She didn't flinch. She unscrewed the cap on a water bottle, took a sip, and replied coolly, "That money went to Brian. He needed a car for work. The car's been bought. Everything's done." Hearing how casually she said it pushed me past the edge. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I screamed, my voice echoing through the house. "You took all the money meant to save my child and you bought a car for Brian? Why? For what? I'm calling the cops." I pulled out my phone and the emergency number was open, but my hand froze halfway. I knew the police wouldn't help. This was a civil matter. The only response I'd get would be, "You'll need to hire a lawyer." I understood that, but in that moment, I had to say it. I had to scream it out loud because if I didn't, if I kept it inside, it would have crushed me from within. A few seconds later, my mother looked up at me. Her eyes were sharp, ice cold. She looked at me like I was a stranger and said, slow and deliberate, "Go ahead, call them. I'm waiting. Who do you think they'll believe? I raised you for over 20 years, and now you come back to demand money from me. Look at your life. What have you even done? Now you're clinging to a baby you might not even be able to keep alive." The moment she finished, Robert walked out of the bedroom. His face was pale, but no tears were left in his eyes. My mother turned to him without hesitation and added, "You two have 30 days. Get out of my house. You turned your back on me. Don't expect to stay here another day." From the couch, Brian swung his feet up onto the table, didn't even look up, and muttered slowly, "If you can't care for your family, maybe someone else should. That's it." When those words left his mouth, I turned to look at my younger brother, the same kid I used to share lunch with in elementary school, the one I protected on the playground every time he got picked on. And now he sat there speaking about me like a burden that needed to be removed. That night, I sat alone in the living room, and I realized if I didn't do something now, the next thing I'd lose might be my husband and the unborn child we were still barely holding on to. That night, after a heated argument that led nowhere except for a string of cold words, everything ended with the slam of a door from my mother and the indifference of my brother. I walked Robert back to our room, my chest heavy with despair. It felt like the walls around us were slowly collapsing. After a few hours of silence, I sat alone in the dark kitchen, my arm resting on the cold table, my mind spinning around one single question. What else can I do? With no other options left, I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to a small law office a former classmate had once told me about. Inside, I was fully committed. I would take my mother to court if it came down to it. Let people say I turned my back on her. I didn't care anymore. What she did was unforgivable. I couldn't stay silent. But first, I needed to find a way to borrow the $1,000 we needed for my first injection, the one that couldn't wait. Yet before I could put that plan in motion, something unexpected happened the next morning. Someone I never thought would show up appeared at our front door. It was my grandmother, Eleanor. I saw her standing tall on our front porch, hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp and piercing, just like the last time I saw her at my father's funeral a few years back. She didn't knock. She didn't call ahead. She just stood there like she'd always known this was when she needed to be here. At first, I didn't understand what was going on, but when Robert stepped out from behind me, eyes red and swollen, I realized this wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't until much later that I found out Robert had been the one to call her. Years ago, my grandmother had told him something important. Call me if anything ever happens, no matter how big or small. Immediately, Grandma lived alone in a small apartment near the church, less than 10 minutes from our house. She had kept quiet for years, quietly watching over us from afar, never interfering, never judging. But this time, the silence had ended. Seeing her standing there, I didn't need to ask anything. One look into her stern, steady eyes told me. She already knew everything, and standing there in that moment, I could feel it. Her arrival wasn't just comfort, it was a sign something was about to change in a big way. Just minutes after my grandmother stepped into the living room, the tense atmosphere thickened into something suffocating. Even at over 80 years old, she had never lost the presence, the authority of the matriarch. Her unexpected arrival could only mean something serious was about to happen. The moment she sat down, the silence shattered as her sharp voice cut through the air. She went straight to the point, demanding my mother explain why she had emptied my account. After a few seconds of silence, with a face completely unmoved, my mother replied in an icy tone, "That money was in a joint account. I had the right to take it. I raised her for all those years. That's just a small return on what I gave. And Brian deserves that car. He needs to work. Unlike Iowa, who keeps wasting money on something that isn't worth it." Hearing that, I saw my grandmother's face go pale with fury. Her eyes flashed with deep disappointment, like she couldn't believe the woman she had once treated like her own daughter could say something so heartless. Seconds later, faster than I could react, my grandmother, with a strength I never imagined from someone her age, grabbed my mother by the hair and dragged her straight out to the front yard. Watching it unfold, I stood frozen. I had never seen her like that. Never seen her so furious, so fierce. Under the harsh morning sun, standing firm in the middle of the yard, her voice rang out like steel as she looked my mother in the eye and commanded, "You give my granddaughter her money back right now, or I'll take this whole damn house." But my mother didn't back down. It was clear she had prepared for this. With a voice laced in mockery, she shot back, "This house is in my name now. You have no rights here." As soon as she said it, I saw my grandmother's hands tremble. Not from weakness, but sheer rage. Her face flushed red, her eyes sharp as knives, but her voice was stronger than ever when she fired back with something I had never heard before. "I was the one who paid for this house years ago to save your marriage from foreclosure. You think I didn't keep records? I still have the bank receipts, the handwritten agreements, and witnesses from that day. Don't you dare test me." Brian, standing near the door, watched the entire scene. He looked like he was about to step in, but one cold, warning glare from Grandma made him freeze. He backed away without a word, not daring to take another step. Right then, Robert moved closer behind me, his hands trembling. I could feel the fear in him, especially as my mother turned her fury toward him, screaming venomous words with a twisted face. "Robert, it was you. You called this older woman here. You're trying to tear this family apart, aren't you?" Hearing my mother scream at my husband like that, something inside me snapped. All the fear, the helplessness, gone. I stepped forward, stood between Robert and my mother, and with a voice louder and stronger than I even knew I had, I stared straight at her and said, "Enough, Mom. Don't you ever speak to Robert like that again. I won't let you lay a hand on him. Not ever." In that moment, I saw something flicker in my mother's eyes. Hesitation. For the first time, she seemed to realize I wasn't the daughter she could manipulate or dismiss anymore. That moment felt like a turning point I'd been waiting for my whole life. But deep inside, I also knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was only getting started, and the days ahead were going to bring even more storms. After dragging my mother out into the yard and declaring she wouldn't be stepping back in that house until the money was dealt with, my grandmother gave us a deadline, 48 hours to hire a lawyer. The goal was clear. File a legal claim to take back ownership of the house my mother had been living in for years. But she didn't stop there. Using nearly all of her remaining savings, close to $7,000, she transferred the money to me so I could get the injection in time. It wasn't just words. It was action. Proof that she wouldn't stand by and watch this fall apart. When she saw Brian's brand new pickup truck parked right out front like a public challenge, Grandma ordered my mother to sell it immediately and use the money to pay me back. And she didn't mince words. She said flat out, "If it doesn't happen, I'll make sure that truck disappears for good." Hearing that, my mother snatched up her phone and started dialing the police. But before she could even hit the call button, my grandmother turned her head, stood tall, and said in a flat, steady voice that sounded like a court order, "Go ahead, call them. I'm 82 years old. I've got nothing to lose. But before they get here, that truck and half this damn yard will be long gone." The house went dead silent after that. Her presence, her fire, it shook everyone in the room. It was like the air had been crushed under the weight of her will. There was no shouting, no fighting back, only the stunned, uneasy stillness when people realize they've just met a force they can't push back. I looked at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. Next to me, Robert stared at her too, like he'd just found solid ground in the middle of a storm. I knew the legal battle ahead wouldn't be easy, but I also knew this now. With Grandma standing beside us, we weren't alone. Right after that tense confrontation, no one gave an official order, but the next morning, my mother and Brian quietly left the house. The brand new pickup rolled out of the driveway like it had never belonged there. I didn't know where they went. And honestly, I didn't care anymore, because for the first time in a long time, I knew I wasn't standing alone. In the days that followed, as we prepared for the lawsuit, my grandmother decided to move in with Robert and me. No one said much about it, but her presence in the house felt like a silent fortress, a quiet wall between us and everything else that had tried to tear us apart. I remembered something my mother once said to me when I was a kid, almost like a sigh. If there's one person who's always scared me, it's your grandma, my mother-in-law. Now I understood why. Grandma didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to prove anything. She lived with integrity, drew clear lines, and when she stepped in, nothing stayed small anymore. In the following days, I kept working my regular shifts at the factory. Robert stayed home to rest and monitor the pregnancy closely. Thanks to the nearly $7,000 Grandma gave us, we could cover a portion of the McKenna injection schedule on time, just as the doctor had prescribed. By week 30, my condition was still stable, but the doctor warned us that the next few weeks would be critical. Every night after work, I'd sit beside Robert, his hand resting on my belly, listening to every tiny movement, like that was the only thing keeping us grounded in the middle of all the chaos. After nearly a month of preparation, the moment my entire family had been waiting for finally arrived. The first civil hearing was held at the Allen County Courthouse on a Monday morning. That day, I showed up with my grandmother and our attorney, Harold Watkins, an old friend, a former state prosecutor who had opened a private practice after retirement. Inside the courtroom, my mother appeared with Brian. Both of them looked fully prepared to fight to the end. She brought a thick folder of documents and filed a countersuit, accusing my grandmother of physical intimidation and violating residential rights. I wasn't surprised. For my mother, counterattacking was always instinct. But Mr. Watkins came in fully prepared. The evidence we presented to the court included bank transfer records showing the house purchase in my parents' names completed in March 2014. All funds used for the payment came directly from Eleanor Thompson, my grandmother, to help her son and daughter-in-law save their home from foreclosure. Receipts and records proving I had been covering all ongoing living expenses for years, utilities, property taxes, maintenance fees, totaling over $500 per month for over 6 years, and a handwritten letter from my father to my grandmother, sent right after the house was purchased, thanking her for using her savings to help keep the house. The letter clearly stated the money was a gift for the family with no expectation of repayment. Abschieds. And most importantly, a recorded conversation between my mother and me on the day the money disappeared, where she admitted to withdrawing the funds to buy Brian a car and plainly said, "I had the right. That account is in my name." Upon hearing the evidence, my mother's legal team tried to push back. They argued the house had already been legally transferred into her name, and the withdrawn funds were a matter of family obligation. But then came the doorbell camera footage. It showed my grandmother stepping out first, grabbing my mother by the arm, pulling her off the porch, and then pointing toward the yard commandingly. As soon as the clip played, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. When the judge asked why my grandmother acted that way, our attorney argued her actions didn't constitute assault. No injuries were inflicted, there was no intent to harm, and it occurred during an attempt to protect legal property and de-escalate a conflict involving a pregnant family member. After more than 3 hours of arguments and evidence, the judge called for a recess to review all submitted materials more thoroughly. 2 weeks later, we returned to court for the final hearing. I wasn't hoping to win, not anymore. After everything, all I wanted was a fair ruling, and this time we got it. As soon as the hearing began, the judge delivered the final verdict. Ownership of the house was to be transferred back to Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, as she had paid for it entirely with her assets, and there was no valid legal agreement to gift it. Mrs. Margaret Thompson was ordered to repay the $29,780 she had withdrawn without consent from my account, money deemed personal property intended for a specific medical purpose with no mutual agreement authorizing its use. and she was also held responsible for all court fees, totaling $3,200, and was fined $500 for filing repeated baseless counterclaims and for intentionally disrupting court proceedings. And additionally, the accusations of physical intimidation made by my mother against Eleanor Thompson were found to have no grounds, neither criminal nor civil, and were dismissed entirely. The ruling would take effect after 7 days. When the judge finished reading the sentence, I lowered my head and stayed there for a long time. I didn't feel happy. I just felt relieved. Because for the first time in months, Robert could finally sleep through the night without worrying about whether we'd have a home tomorrow. As for my mother, after receiving the court's decision, it seemed she couldn't accept the outcome. She filed appeal after appeal for 3 straight weeks, all denied due to lack of legal basis and no new evidence. And so, my mother and Brian, once living comfortably under a stable roof, lost everything. Not because of bad luck, but because they refused to accept fairness, and because they didn't know when to stop feeding their greed. After all this, I thought my grandmother would stay with us a little longer, but a week later, she called me to the porch and placed a folder in my hands, fully notarized documents transferring the house into my name. She didn't look me in the eye. She just said quietly, "This house is yours now. As for your mother, I have nothing more to say." And the next morning, she left. She returned to her small apartment near the church, where she had lived alone for 10 years after Grandpa passed. I stood in the doorway, watching her figure fade down the narrow alley until she was out of sight. What I felt wasn't grief, it was emptiness. Not because something was lost, but because I knew even if we had won back the house, a part of this family would never be whole again. And deep down, I had a feeling this wasn't the end. After Grandma left, the house returned to a strange kind of quiet. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence that settles right before a storm. My mother and Brian had packed up and left just 1 day after the court's decision. They didn't say a word. No apologies, no explanations. Just quietly loaded their things into the car and drove away like the house had never been theirs. I still remember the way my mother looked at Grandma that morning. There was no more rage or shouting, only something that felt like bitterness and helplessness. And Grandma stood there, back straight on the porch, eyes steady and unflinching. A few hours later, she left too. Before she got in the car, she looked at me for a long time and said, "I didn't do this just to bring justice for you and the baby. I did it to end Margaret's long line of mistakes that took my son from me, and this time I'm not forgiving her." After everything, I stood alone in the middle of the living room, the light from the kitchen casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floor. Her words echoed in my mind, cold but filled with love in the only way she knew how to give it. I thought that after all of this, after fighting for every dollar to keep our child safe, our family would finally get a moment of peace. But just a few days later, once again, everything was turned upside down. It was a night in mid-June. I was organizing the paperwork for my next McKenna injection in the kitchen when Robert called out to me from the bedroom. He was clutching a pillow, drenched in sweat, his hands trembling from the pain in his stomach. I rushed him to the hospital immediately, even with the injections administered on schedule. I went into preterm labor at 32 weeks. Liam was born at 3:00 a.m., weighing just 1.8 kilograms. The doctor told us that at 32 weeks, a baby's lungs are still underdeveloped. Liam couldn't feed on his own yet. His breathing was shallow and required oxygen support. He wasn't in critical condition, but he was taken straight to the NICU for respiratory and digestive monitoring. I still remember what one of the nurses quietly told me out in the hallway. 32 weeks. Chances of survival are high, but you'll need to be patient. He needs time. The first time I saw my son through the glass of the incubator, I couldn't say a word. His eyes were shut tight, his tiny body wrapped in wires and breathing tubes, but his chest still rose and fell little by little, fighting for every breath like his life depended on it. And because of that, because we had already lost 2 babies before, when we saw Liam fighting with every weak, instinctive breath, we refused to break. If our son was still fighting, then so were we. We'd already lost everything once. There was no reason to give up now. Grandma came to the hospital the next morning. She stood quietly at the glass, looking in for a long time before gently placing her wrinkled hand on my shoulder. Her voice softened as her eyes focused on Liam. She whispered, "This child was born to survive. He'll make it. just like his parents did. Right then, I saw Robert turn his face away, tears rolling down his cheeks, but he was smiling. And I knew the man standing next to me had grown stronger through all the heartbreak. And this time, no matter how uncertain the road ahead was, he wasn't going to let it slip away again. For days after, I barely left the hospital. After every shift at the factory, I went straight to the NICU to take over for Robert. I checked the intravenous lines, watched Liam through the glass, prayed over every oxygen level, every breath. We took turns staying with him. We stopped counting hours, stopped knowing what day it was. Every time that tiny body moved a finger, every raspy breath from behind that mask, our faith grew just a little more. But even holding his hand through the glass, I didn't dare tell myself we'd made it, because deep down, I knew the hardest part hadn't come yet. And this time it was no longer in my hands. After more than 2 months in the incubator, through countless blood transfusions, tube changes, and sleepless nights, Liam finally made it past the most critical stage. The doctors told us he would be discharged the following week. But before that joy fully settled in, we were given more news. Because he was born at just 32 weeks, Liam's lungs hadn't had time to develop fully. He had survived, but the lung damage was permanent. He would need oxygen support for at least the first 3 to 4 years of his life, with monthly respiratory evaluations to monitor his condition closely. When I heard that, I looked over at Robert. He was crying, but I could tell these weren't the tears of fear or despair like before. This time, they were the tears of a father who had just been told his child wouldn't grow up like other kids, and still felt nothing but gratitude. Because somehow, against all odds, we had kept our son alive until this moment. And for us, just seeing him grow, getting to touch his cheek every morning, that was already the most extraordinary miracle life could ever give us. A few days later, the house I had grown up in, the one I thought we'd lost forever, welcomed a new member home. We tucked a small oxygen tank neatly beside his crib. Robert tracked every breath. I took the night shifts, checking the humidifier and oxygen levels before bed. This new life wasn't easy, but it was real. There were nights we were so exhausted we forgot what day it was. But then Liam would raise his tiny hand and smile, and every ounce of fatigue disappeared. Happiness was never loud. It came quietly in moments that seemed ordinary. I thought after everything that maybe, just maybe, we were finally okay. But what I didn't know was that someone still hadn't let go. And this time, they weren't coming for me. They were coming for the child. When Liam was 6 months old, we were still living daily with one purpose: to keep him safe and healthy. Every weekend, Grandma would quietly come by to help, never needing to be asked. But then, one unannounced Saturday morning, my mother and Brian showed up in our front yard. I heard Robert's voice before I even saw what was happening. "Get out of here. You don't deserve to touch him." When I ran outside, my mother and brother stood beside Liam's crib on the patio. Robert was standing between them and the baby, his eyes red, breath short, but his body firm, like a shield that would not move. It was the first time since we married that I had seen Robert that angry. He wasn't the quiet, patient man I had always known. He was a father, ready to do whatever it took to protect the child he had almost lost. A few seconds later, my mother spoke, her voice soft, fake sweet. "I just came to see my grandson for a moment. I wasn't going to do anything." Then Brian chimed in, hands in his pockets, calm as ever. "That's my nephew. I have a right to see him." Hearing that, I snapped. Everything I had been holding in for months, the night we lost all the money, Robert's silent tears, Liam's fragile breaths through plastic tubes, all of it surged up and spilled out of me. "All right," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You said he didn't deserve to live. You emptied the account meant to save him and bought a car. And you, Mom, you said he never belonged in this family." I paused, stared them both dead in the eye, and said, "Get off my property. From this day forward, you are no longer my mother." Behind me, Grandma stood at the front door. She didn't say a word this time, but I knew she was letting us stand on our own now, letting us defend our family ourselves. Minutes later, the police arrived. I explained everything, showed them the court ruling, and formally requested they leave the property. They didn't resist. But before walking away, my mother turned back one last time. Her face didn't show anger, just a hollow emptiness. A few days later, I filed for a permanent restraining order against both of them. To me, the fact that they had the nerve to show up and claim Liam as their family after everything they'd done, it was an insult I would never forgive. I wouldn't let my child grow up in a world where love was conditional and family could be bargained for. After that, life returned to our usual rhythm. Still sleepless nights, still adjusting oxygen machines, but now no more shadows were standing outside our gate. And in the quietest moments, when Robert had fallen asleep next to the crib and Liam reached out his tiny hand in a dream, I finally understood. Family isn't where we're born. It's the place we choose to stand and protect, no matter what it costs. And today marks exactly 3 years since that fateful day. I've asked myself 1,000 times why my mother did what she did. Why did she choose to treat the two of us so differently? Was it because I didn't live up to her expectations? Or was it simply because I chose to keep a child after so many losses? But in the end, I stopped searching for an answer. Because to me, blood alone doesn't define family. And if love only exists when you're obedient or convenient, it was never love. Real family shows up when you're at your weakest and lost, and someone still chooses to stay. And I have that. I have my grandmother, I have Robert, and I have Liam. Today, Robert returned to work from home. It's not as demanding as before, but I can see something in his eyes has returned, a piece of the strong man he used to be. As for Liam, he still needs his oxygen at night, but during the day, he runs and laughs like any other kid. And the moment I'll never forget, the first word he ever said wasn't mom or dad, it was grandma. The first time he called her that, Grandma froze. She didn't say a word, just turned her face slightly and wiped the corner of her eye. And I knew, for her, that was enough. As for me, I'm still the woman who works 6 days a week, who changes oxygen tubes at night and quietly records every irregular breath in a notebook. Not great with words, not perfect, but I've kept this family together in the most honest way I knew how. And if you're ever forced to choose between blood and kindness, choose kindness. Because that's what will stay with you when every other bond has already walked away. That's where my story ends. But before I close this chapter, I want to ask you, the ones who've stayed with me to these final moments, was I wrong for choosing to stand by my child instead of the one who gave birth to me? Please share your thoughts. I genuinely want to hear what you think. And if this story touched something in you, even just a little, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can walk together through whatever comes next. Thank you truly for being here.